Hi, welcome to session 3 of the ninth topic of the semester, the last topic on the Civil War in Reconstruction from 1860 to 1877. So this is the third session. This is the final session, by the way. Not only the final session of this topic, but also is the last session of the semester as well. And now we're going to be moving into Reconstruction. So we already covered quite thoroughly the Civil War in session 1 and session 2, looking at the historical background. We looked at a series of factors that divided the country historically: sectionalism, territorial expansionism, the issue of slavery, the abolitionist movement, political parties, and the presidential election of 1860 that really led to the secession crisis. The South seceded from the Union when Lincoln was elected president in 1860, running under the Republican Party, which actually was created in 1854 by abolitionist parties like the Whig Party, the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, that created this grand party, this abolitionist party, that nominated Lincoln for the presidency, and of course he won the election, and that caused the South, starting with South Carolina, to secede from the Union state by state. We're going to see a series of states, the slaveholding states, the southern states, are going to form an alliance, the Confederacy, something we saw in session 2 very quickly, by the way. The declaration of war, again, after South Carolina attacked Fort Sumter. It's a federal fort that actually attacked a fort and a ship that was carrying supplies there. Of course, we now again saw the war starting in 1861. The Union, the North, now fighting the Confederacy, the South, for about 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. And of course, we looked at a series of factors that led to the defeat of the Confederacy. Again, the inability to raise revenues through taxes, for example, that it did not have sufficient crop consumption, agriculture as well. That caused food riots, starvation, etc. Across the South. We got limited technology as well. There were really no efforts to industrialize in the South, so there were no factories, very little railroads. And so they were really fighting now a technological war in which they were overpowered, by a very technological industrial North that was very well prepared, had a very, very efficient system of transportation, factories, that everything that the Union troops required, they actually manufactured very quickly. And again, this really, again, were weaknesses of the Confederacy that eventually, again, this is just going to lead to the defeat of the South, the inability to use their own slaves for military purposes, and so on. And so all of those issues combined, again, are going to cause the defeat of the Confederacy. So we were looking at that. Of course, Lincoln implemented a series of policies also to accelerate the defeat of the South, like the naval blockade. We were looking at the naval blockade. The South was unable to export cotton to the outside. The Emancipation Proclamation, again, the order to release the slaves in the midst of the war in order to take away one of the greatest assets that the Confederacy had, which was, again, the system of labor that the South had. It was really one of the greatest assets to carry out war. And of course, the destruction of Southern infrastructure as well. Railroads, very little railroads the South had were destroyed, barns, warehouses, cotton plantations, and so on. And with that, of course, we saw the South surrendering by 1865, in April. So now, this last portion is going to look at the process of Reconstruction. So if we can now go to the slide. This is part 3. And once again, this is the last session. This is the last segment that we're going to look at in this U.S. History 1301, which is really looking at the aftermath outcomes of the Civil War in the process of Reconstruction. This is what we're going to do here, just to understand, for example, what were the outcomes of the Civil War, and then look at Reconstruction rather briefly here. So some of the outcomes of the Civil War, again, is that this was a very dramatic moment in U.S. history, very dramatic, in which Americans felt very passionate about their point of view, so much so that they were willing to defend it, even again in the field of battle. Okay, so now that we have the abolitionist movement also in the North, in which many Northerners were also inspired by religious ideas as well, that they were on the right side of history because they condemned slavery as a sin and so on. This was a very intense fight, again, that left about 1 million soldiers dead. Okay, the Confederacy lost 600,000 soldiers, 600,000 casualties, and the Union 400,000. So again, this is staggering amounts of people dead. Again, laying dead at the end of the war. So more soldiers actually died in the Civil War than in all of the other U.S. conflicts combined. So in other words, more soldiers died in the Civil War than all of the soldiers that died in the Spanish-American War, in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, etc. Again, in single battles, for example, okay, like the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, in the Civil War, there were about 80,000 soldiers that died. That's the amount of soldiers, of U.S. soldiers that died in the entire Vietnam War, that spanned for about 10 years. So it took about 10 years for the U.S. to lose 80,000 soldiers, whereas here in a single battle, okay, the Battle of Gettysburg, that lasted a few weeks, the same amount of people lost their lives. So this is something to keep in mind, that the Civil War really marked a very, very important moment in U.S. history because, the Union was at stake, first and foremost. Are we going to see the emergence of two countries now? That was really the idea that the South had. They wanted to really create a separate republic or separate alliance. But also the other is, again, slavery, okay? The issue of slavery. I mean, are we going to continue with slavery into the future? Okay. Well, again, so those were very important ideas that people were actually fighting. And the North was fighting for the Union, and the South was fighting to maintain slavery. So the South lost a fourth of its male population. A fourth of its male population, again, lost their lives in the South. So this was a conflict that devastated the South in so many ways. Not only the loss of life, but also the Southern economy and the Southern culture were devastated. The economy was totally shattered as a result of the war because of the inability for the South to export cotton, and because many cotton plantations and barns and warehouses were destroyed as well. And so whatever little resources they had, they were trying to scramble for those resources to feed the troops or to feed themselves. So again, the Southern economy lay in ruins, really, and the culture as well. The way of life, the way people lived for centuries in the South, just came to an end altogether. Okay, came to an end. All right. So let's move forward then. Now let's look at Reconstruction, okay, from 1863 to 1877. So now the year 1863 is really in the middle of the Civil War. So the question is, why is it that Reconstruction began before the official ending of the war in 1865? Okay, so, and it ended in 1877, by the way. By 1877, this process of Reconstruction was, quote unquote, completed, even though there were so many pending, unfinished policies, unfinished businesses. Again, that were pretty much that remained there. That were not really. Again, it was not. The process of Reconstruction was not totally completed as such, but it was now closed. The issue was, now closed by 1877. So I mentioned, why 1873? I'm sorry, why 1863? Why is it that by 1863 we start the process of Reconstruction? Is because by 1863 there were sure signs that the Confederacy was going to lose. So there were already food riots. It was evident that the Southern economy was experiencing severe problems, financial problems, and once again, food production was very, very scarce as well. So it was just a matter of time when the Confederacy was going to surrender. So as soon as 1863, we're going to see that in this last or latter stage of the Civil War, from 1863 to 65, the process of Reconstruction begins, even though the war has not yet come to an end, but it does again begin. Lincoln's administration, Republicans in Congress, again, are going to move forward now with the policies to start rebuilding the country. That's what Reconstruction is, the process of rebuilding the United States, rebuilding the South, particularly reforming the South. So again, Reconstruction entailed rebuilding, reuniting the North and the South, but in a way that the South was going to be reformed before it was rejoined again with the rest of the country. So it's rebuilding the nation, but in a way that we're not going to take the South back the way it was in the past. In other words, there has to be certain changes, certain reforms that the South has to go through before we once again accept it, back into the Union. Okay, so that's the whole, idea of Reconstruction. Rebuilding, reuniting, and reforming. So it was before, the war comes to an end that that Republicans, again, Lincoln and his party, start brainstorming as to, okay, so what kind of changes, we need to implement in the South. So it could, Southern society, it could be ready, it could be acceptable to come back into the Union. Okay, so it was first and foremost, it was agreed that the first requirement is, well, we need to abolish slavery. Okay, so slavery has to go. So everybody agrees on that issue. Okay, so the first stage of Reconstruction started during wartime. This is called wartime Reconstruction, in which, as I mentioned, in 1863, Lincoln came forth, President Lincoln, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Okay, so this is pretty much laying the groundwork, if you will, for how we're going to be moving forward. In other words, look, first and foremost, let's emancipate the slaves. So he issued the order to the Union generals in the South that from now on, we have a new war aim. So the war aim of the Union Army in the South is to free the slaves. In other words, this is what we're fighting for. But once again, the practical side to the Emancipation Proclamation was that besides that, this is something that it was required. There's no negotiation as to whether whether we're gonna keep slavery or abolish it. We're gonna abolish it again. So again, long term, this is a must. In other words, this is something that we have to do. But there's also a practical matter, and the practical matter is that slaves were the backbone of the Confederate economy. So if you start taking away their slaves as soon as 1863, then you're going to accelerate the Confederate defeat. Okay, so it was also a practical matter. It is a war strategy, let's just put it that way, that we start building the country by first and foremost ordering the Union Army to free the slaves. And we start with that, okay? So this is part of wartime Reconstruction. This is the first stage of Reconstruction during wartime, that we have to, end slavery. So this is the beginning stages of that. Now, at this point, as we look at 1863-64, what we're going to see is that in Congress, which is really at this point dominated by the Republican Party, because this is the party of the Union, by the way. This is the party of the North. When the South seceded from the Union, all of the Southern congressmen from the Democratic Party left Washington, D.C. So at this point, there's only Republicans in Congress. Well, this Republican Party in Congress is going to be implementing the legislation, the policies of Reconstruction. And at this point, we're going to see the rise of a minority group within the party that will be known as the Radical Republicans, okay? Because those were senators, particularly. Again, we're talking about Republican senators, for example, like Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania and Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who were abolitionists in the religious sense of the word, meaning that they were deeply religious individuals who really believed that on one hand, slavery was a sin. That's just to begin with. And then, second of all, that they believe that they have been given a mission by God to reform American society. That they were, in other words, sent by God to live in the United States in this critical hour of the nation's history in order to reform the United States in a way that they were going to give birth to a whole new society, okay, to recreate American society according to what they believed, how God actually wanted, the United States to be. That in other words, that God had a plan, in other words, okay, for the United States, just like every country, they believe it has a certain destiny, a certain plan, a certain future to fulfill. Well, they also believe that the United States was destined to become a multicultural, multiracial society. And they call that the interracial democracy. Okay, interracial democracy. So what does this mean? Again, it means that what they believed is that the United States was destined to really become a society in which there will be a multiplicity of different, what they call races. We call them ethnic groups, for example. Okay, ethnic groups or races, etc. And in that, like a melting pot, in other words, that the United States was destined to become a melting pot that was inevitable, in that that the people of the United States were going to be equally represented in the state. They will enjoy equal protection of the law. They'll have the same equal status before the law. They will enjoy the same civil liberties, civil rights, and the like. That
issues of race and ethnicity and culture, religion, that those are not going to be important again for how they're going to participate, how they're going to experience life inside of the United States, because they were all simply going to be citizens that were going to be treated equal, in other words. Okay, we call interracial democracy. Everybody will have equal opportunities to enjoy the resources of the country, like land, for example, to have their own enterprises, to have a good education as well that will be open for all people. The right to vote as well, the right to hold office. That those are rights that will be universal, applicable to all citizens, regardless of race, color, etc. Culture, religion. That doesn't matter, okay? Because if you live in the United States, then you live in a democracy. But this democracy is not just for one group of people, okay? It's not for one race. This democracy is not just for one ethnicity, but it's for a multiplicity, for all races, for all ethnicities, for all people. It's called an interracial or multiracial democracy, okay? So they believe that. Again, this is their own idea. So what they are suggesting is that it's not just enough to free the slaves. It's not just enough to liberate the slaves from the South and just bring back the South like that. Like, well, there's 4.5 million slaves in the South. We're going to free them. And then, that's it. We just bring them, back into the country. Because what they say is, then what's going to happen afterwards? What's going to happen to the freed population? Are they going to, have an opportunity, to prosper economically in the United States? Are they going to have the opportunity to get an education? Will they be able to own their own land and become independent, let's say farmers, for example? Will they be able to vote and hold office? Or are they just going to be freed and then somehow just return back to the plantation to continue, carrying out agricultural labor or providing agricultural labor to plantation owners, perhaps under a new system, if you will? So are they going to enjoy all the liberties, all the privileges that American citizens enjoy under the Constitution? For them, they want a deep radical change. That's why they're called the radical Republicans. For them, the idea of Reconstruction is not just freeing the slaves. They want radical change to take place in the South. Deep radical change. Okay? That will include, for example, civil rights and voting rights for the freed population. In other words, look, we need to grant them citizenship. Okay, because so far they're not citizens, so we need to grant them citizenship so they can enjoy all the privileges, and guarantees and liberties of the Constitution. So they can have, in other words, that the Bill of Rights is also extended upon the population, that they enjoy also the protection of the Bill of Rights, for example. And also the right to vote. Are they going to be allowed to vote or not? Again, voting rights as well. So they were even talking about, let me just write it right here. I think it's written. Yeah, sorry, it's written. Sorry. They were even talking about, actually land reform, land distribution, in which they wanted to break up the largest plantations in the South in order to award every family, of the freed population with 40 acres and a mule. In other words, look, we need to make sure that they're going to become independent, that they're not going to return to the plantation to grow cotton, but rather that they'll be economically self-sufficient. So the only way that can happen is if they own land. So we're not talking about giving them a lot of land, just enough to feed a family. 40 acres is enough, so give them 40 acres and a mule, and a mule is like a little, is what back then used to be like a tractor. You know, you have a mule, you tie a plow to a mule, and you can actually till the land, you know, for agriculture. So again, so if you do that, they say, then we're going to have, of course, you know, a new South. They wanted a totally new South, totally reformed, in which slavery was not just going to be abolished, but the population will be integrated into the national life of the country, into the economic and political life of the United States. So they were known as the Radical Republicans, and initially they started out as a handful of them. Again, it was Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, but over time, this group will start growing in numbers. So initially they're just a tiny minority, because the rest of the Republican Party, when they hear those ideas, they just think that it's just too radical. In other words, that, like, well, those are very good ideas, but I don't know if they're going to be accepted, or we don't know if we're going to push the South to change that much, you know. So most Republicans at this point just agree that what the South needed was to abolish slavery. Once you abolish slavery, you know, we can bring back those states into the Union, but they need to abolish slavery. So that's why in 1864 the consensus was across, you know, Congress, that it was necessary before the end of the war to abolish slavery in the Constitution. They said, we need to abolish slavery in the Constitution as soon as possible. So before we wait to have the South surrender and begin the process of Reconstruction, let's end slavery in the Constitution, because that's going to be a requirement that any state that seceded from the Union, if they want to come back, then they will have to abolish slavery, because now it's illegal in the country, again, under the Constitution. So they passed the 13th Amendment, you know, that prohibited slavery. Is illegal now, you know, in 1864, you know, under the Constitution is illegal. So that's, again, something that it was very much agreed upon, literally, all Republicans, both in the Senate and the House, you know, pretty much, again, across the North. This is the vision, again, of the North. So that's, you know, wartime Reconstruction, still considered wartime Reconstruction, you know. And also, during wartime Reconstruction, just as soon as the South is about to surrender, okay, in that moment, again, nearing the end of the war, Republicans in Congress created an agency that is going to be instrumental for the process of Reconstruction, and that agency was called the Freedman's Bureau. Okay, the Freedman's Bureau, in which this is an extension of the Union Army that is going to carry out certain work in the South in the coming years. What kind of work? Well, they're going to make sure that all slaves will be free. In other words, look, that no planter, no slave owner is going to withhold slaves in the plantation and refuse to set them free. In other words, we're going to enforce the emancipation of slaves and protect them as well, because, again, the freed population will have to be physically protected, because as the war was coming to a close, of course, the losing side, the Confederates in this case, were going to be very resentful at the fact that they were defeated, of course, and that the slaves were being liberated. And so there was the concern that the ex-Confederate soldiers might retaliate against the slaves as they're setting them free, or they're being forced to set them free, that they could indeed inflict some form of of punishment, or they could unleash their anger upon them and so on again. So to physically protect them, and also to settle disputes, that in case there will be a dispute between, let's say, a plantation owner and now a freedman, what they call a freedman in that case, because the plantation owner might say, yeah, I'm actually setting everybody free, but somebody here owes me money, in other words, because a few months ago, when that person used to be a slave, that person asked me for money and so on. So I need that person to actually stay here in the plantation and work for me to pay that debt. Again, there were situations like that. And so the Freedman Bureau was to intervene and kind of settle those disputes. It was essential. It was essential, again, to create the Freedmen's Bureau. The idea was to create the Bureau and granted a lifespan. Initially it was to carry out functions in a year cycle. That is to say, every year the Freedmen's Bureau will have to be renewed. It would had a 1 year, contract to exist by Congress, and every year the Freedmen's Bureau will have to be renewed. So at any rate, that was wartime Reconstruction. This is the first phase of Reconstruction. So after the war comes to an end, we go through another phase of Reconstruction that is called Presidential Reconstruction. Okay, Presidential Reconstruction. Historians, when they go back again and look at this process of Reconstruction, they identify that this process unfolded in stages. Okay, and so those are the three stages we're going to cover. So far we have covered one, which is wartime Reconstruction. The other stage or phase is called Presidential Reconstruction, because during this particular stage, the president was in charge. He was the leader of Reconstruction. The president was leading the way. He was the one that was making the proposals. He was the one that was actually suggesting, certain plans for bringing back the South and so on. And everybody was turning to the president for leadership. It was just something that was naturally unfolding again, in this process, particularly because again there had been a war, the Civil War, and of course during wartime, the presidents are the natural embodiment again of the leader of the country, in other words. So they're also the leaders of Reconstruction. Okay, so during presidential Reconstruction, what we see is that there will be two presidents that were leading the way during this time, but each implemented different policies that were very different from one another, by the way. But as we'll see, one of those presidents is going to actually create controversies in the United States, particularly inside of the Republican Party, and eventually this is going to lead to an impeachment process, okay, as we'll see. But first and foremost, the first president that was leading the way and trying to bring back the country to save the Union was Abraham Lincoln. Again, he was the president that was leading the way during the Civil War. When the South seceded, of course, it was Lincoln that was in charge, and he was the commander-in-chief of the Union forces and so on. And so because Lincoln was reelected in 1864, people were turning to him for leadership, of course, for guidance, and he was, of course, trying to save the Union. He was fighting the South, but he really wanted to save the Union in a way that he implemented a plan, a strategy, an offer for the South to come back as quickly as possible. Okay, so his plan is, look, I want to restore the Union as soon as possible, so I'm not going to set the bar really high for the southern states, but rather I just want those southern states to abolish slavery. And so as soon as they do that and they write new constitutions that prohibit slavery in those states, okay, then as far as I'm concerned, they're totally ready to come back. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln came up with what is called the Lincoln's 10% plan. 10%. Okay, this is a plan that he offered in the last year and a half of the war from 1863 to 65. What the Lincoln's 10% plan is that he was actually announcing to the South, in the South, by the way, not everybody agreed with slavery. Okay, not everybody agreed with secession. This is very important. Okay, it was very well known there was a significant amount of people in every state of the South that wanted to come back to the Union. As a matter of fact, that they disagreed with the decision to secede. They even disagreed with the institution of slavery. They didn't own any slaves. They thought it was barbaric and such. So he was actually talking to them, the more progressives, in other words, wing of the Democratic Party in the South, because they were within the Democratic Party in the South, there were the hardcore Democrats that they were, in favor of slavery and secession, the fire eaters they were called, but there was also like the progressive, more liberal, wing of the Democratic Party that were known as the Unionists. They always favored, staying inside of the United States. They favored the Union and so on. They were very progressive minded. And Lincoln was actually talking to them. Okay, that look, if you get together, okay, you, the progressives, the more open-minded, the Unionists, in other words, in the South, that if you get together in a city, you write a new constitution, you set up a new government in any of the cities of your state, you write a constitution that prohibits slavery, you're welcome back. It only takes, he said, 10% of the population, again, to support this new constitution, this new state, for you to be legal. In other words, you don't have to have the vast majority of the people in your state supporting you as the new government. Only 10%, with only 10%, again, of the population that actually support this new constitution that prohibits slavery, you're good to go. You can actually create a new political system altogether, a new political order, and you're welcome back. In other words, some states in the South, some populations were very, very, very much attracted to the 10% plan. In Louisiana, for example, there were Unionists there, Unionist Democrats that really, considered very seriously this offer. They said this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They were already holding meetings to write a new constitution, and they were in the process of actually sending the new constitution to Washington. But unfortunately, Lincoln dies in office in 1865, and this plan was dropped, so to speak, because this was part of Lincoln's proposal. So Louisiana was not able to come back to the Union under the 10% plan. So after Lincoln's death, what we see is that his vice president, Andrew Johnson, now takes office, in 1865. And he's going to become now the leader of Reconstruction. It's called Presidential Reconstruction. So Lincoln was the leader, but now Johnson is, Andrew Johnson. Now, what we need to know about Andrew Johnson is that Lincoln actually, when he ran for re-election in 1864, Lincoln picked Johnson very strategically because he was from the South. He was from Tennessee, by the way. So he wanted to pick a Southerner to run as his running mate for VP, because he wanted to make a connection. He wanted to build a bridge with the South, saying, look, this is not just a war between the North and the South. Look, I'm actually bringing in a Southerner here. He was a Unionist Democrat. Okay, he was one of those Unionists, in other words. He was part of the Democratic Party, but he was a Unionist, not a secessionist. He was not a fire eater, in other words. So it was considered strategic, this choice. But when Johnson became president after Lincoln's death, Johnson started clashing very, very quickly with the Republican Party, because he's not Republican per se, because he's from the South. He's from Tennessee. He was born and raised in Tennessee, by the way. So his whole worldview has been shaped by his own upbringing, Southern culture and Southern society. So he looks at life, he looks at the country through the lens of the South. Okay? And so even though he is now representing the Union, that really didn't mean anything, because now that he's the president, he's going to lead the Reconstruction process in a way that Northern Republicans are not going to agree. Southerners actually agree. The Confederates were very happy with Johnson, by the way, but not the Republicans of the North. They were not. So he's going to actually fall out of favor. He's going to fall out of grace, by the way, in the Republican Party, and he's going to clash with them. We're going to see in which particular way. So, first and foremost, he's going to come out and say that he does not agree with radical change, that the vision of the radical Republicans, they're trying to, grant civil rights and voting rights and, to the freed population, to build schools for them, and 40 acres and a mule, and land distribution. Johnson says that that's not going to happen, at least under his watch. In other words, that he's not going to allow that. In other words, because he doesn't believe in interracial democracy. He just doesn't. Again, so because he's a Southerner, by the way. So maybe he understood very well, Southerners, that he realized that those ideas were going to take a long time and perhaps never even materialize in the South. That Southerners were simply going to, resist any type of change that will elevate the African American. Well, in this case, they're not considered yet African Americans because they're not being given citizenship. But that the freed population, that Southerners were not going to allow the freed population to rise up to be equals, with the South, with the rest of society. So he's going to be a very fierce, vocal opponent of this interracial democracy vision of the radical Republicans. He rejected that, in other words. He lowered the bar, so much that he said, look, we don't need, more change than just simply the abolition of slavery. That's about it. So if the South abolishes slavery, then they're good to go. They can come back. But it was not just that was problematic, that he just did not want to reform Southern society, but he was also very lenient towards the South. He was very lenient in that his policies towards the South were such that he allowed for the restoration, the temporary restoration of the ex-Confederates back in power. So what that meant is that when the South lost, when they surrendered, all of the leadership, all of the mayors, the governors, the legislators of all the Confederate states, they were ousted from office. When the Union Army entered the states and the state surrendered, all of the leadership, all of those ex-Confederate officials were taken out of power, and in many cases, some of them were actually imprisoned for treason. That was considered treasonous, to fight the United States, of course. So what Johnson allowed is for those individuals to come back to office, to regain their post. This was totally unacceptable, even by normal standards. Again, it was just, unacceptable to have now the South once again in the hands of the same people that led the secession and fought the Union. In other words, that they're back in power. So nothing will get done. Any policy, any bill that Congress passes to bring about any change, even as something so minor, if you will, to take place, that those individuals were simply going to refuse to follow orders, because the same people that fought the Union are back. In other words, they're back in power. And in many cases, what Johnson is also doing is that he's issuing thousands and thousands of pardons to ex-Confederate officials that were thrown to prison for treason. There were, hundreds of Confederate officers serving sentences now. But Johnson, because he had the power to pardon, the presidents have that particular privilege. Johnson was abusing, if you will, that power by pardoning ex-Confederates as well, right and left. So what that meant is there will be no change, okay? No change at all. So if there was an expectation that there will be certain reforms, that the South was going to change in any ways, now, under Johnson, it's just like he's preventing change from taking place because of his leniency, if you will. So the South, under Johnson, is the ex-Confederates are back in power. So with that, what we're going to see is that because the ex-Confederates are back in power, it was now possible for the Union Army to be now facing a new challenge. Because even though they have defeated the Confederate Army, this Confederate Army went underground. And now, because the Confederates are back in office, it was made possible for that underground Confederate or ex-Confederate army to be conducting what is called guerrilla warfare. Okay. So what is guerrilla warfare? Guerrilla warfare is hit and run tactics. It's not that they're coming out and fighting the Union one-to-one. It's just that they're conducting raids at night of Union camps or doing hit and run. They run to the wilderness, or they hide, etc. So the situation is becoming quite unbearable, under Johnson for the Union Army. It's called guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics, in other words. The Freedmen's Bureau is also under severe pressure in the South because Johnson doesn't support it. Johnson doesn't believe in the Freedmen's Bureau. As a matter of fact, it thinks that it's totally unnecessary. This is useless, in other words, because it protects the free population. So he's not really a big supporter of the Freedmen's Bureau. And under Johnson in the South, the Freedmen's Bureau, the officers that were the administrators, those that were managing the Freedmen's Bureau, are going to be suffering from not only criticism but even from violence, They were known as the carpetbaggers, they were called. Carpetbaggers in the South was a term to mean an opportunist, a northerner who wanted to make money by serving in any of the union agencies or union institutions that were now coming to the South to abuse the South, to extract wealth, to rob people's resources, to cut deals. In other words, that they were corrupt. They were carpetbaggers. That was a very negative term, again, to mean somebody who was just coming to the South not to help Southerners, not to help rebuild the South, but to take advantage of the Southern population, take advantage of the people, take advantage of even the women, Southern women, and so on. That they were corrupt, in other words. Okay, so under Johnson, the Freedmen's Bureau is under heavy pressure, and of course, planters, therefore, because the Freedmen's Bureau is having a difficult time operating in the South, planters delayed emancipation. In other words, instead of following the Emancipation Proclamation to release their slaves, they were simply delaying it. In other words, look, if nobody comes to my plantation to force me set my slaves free, well, I don't need to set them free. In other words, just delaying, this process. Also, there was a persecution of escaped slaves. And it's something, again, that slaves were not supposed to be slaves anymore. But in the South, still, the states of the South had not yet made slavery illegal. They're still not part of the Union. So to go back to the Union, they have to free the slaves in their constitutions. So because in the South, the slaves feel that, well, the South has been defeated, now I can just step out of the plantation. I'm going to just go, leave. This is the end of it, in other words. Well, as soon as they were stepping out of the plantation, they were considered escaped slaves, and they were persecuted again. They were pursued and so on, punished in many cases as well. So this is another very unfortunate, again, circumstance under Johnson, again, that the South is really, it's almost like nothing happened, except, of course, the Civil War happened. It was very devastating, but they're holding on to that institution in different ways. And so another thing that happens under Johnson is that the South is going to see then the opportunity to try to preserve the pre-war labor system, perhaps under a new guise. Okay. Well, as the Union Army is wherever is going, is setting the slaves free, by the way. But the Union Army cannot go everywhere. Okay. So it's just wherever the Union Army is going, they're setting the slaves free. Well, there are now tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of free men and women that are moving from place to place with no place to go because they have been set free. So they're now free and they're walking around, they're in the countryside, they move from one town to another. And so Southern planters wanted to bring, their former slaves back into the plantation, but not as slaves anymore, because they understand that system has to change. But they want to preserve it, perhaps under a new guise. So that led to a strategy, in which it was in the South now by law, it was prohibited to actually roam around the countryside without unemployment. Okay, so all of those laws in the South that are trying to get all of the freed population back to plantations were known as the Black Codes. Okay, the Black Codes. So the Black Codes is simply, again, a law that Southern states were passing at the state level, in which it kind of forced, if you will, okay, the freed population to go back to the plantation, perhaps not to the same one that they used to work for, provide labor to, but to any, again, of the southern plantations. For example, one of those black codes were known as the vagrancy laws. Vagrancy. Okay, so what is the vagrancy law? Well, a vagrancy law is simply, again, a law that prohibit, okay, people roaming around without employment. Vagrancy is just to roam around, okay, without any residence, without employment, without a job. And so, because it was now prohibited, then the only way out was that, well, you need to take a job. Okay, so there were many jobs offered at that point, and the jobs were in the plantations. And plantations are transitioning to become now agricultural companies, by the way. They're owned by a landowner. He's no longer a slave owner, okay, or a plantation owner, but that person is becoming now, known as a merchant, an investor, a landowner, which is a commercial landowner. He's running an agricultural company, etc. So that individual needed labor, and of course, to avoid the fines, to avoid the penalties for breaking the vagrancy laws, many of them were returning to plantations, and they were signing what is called a labor contract. Okay, in other words, look, you're not going to be a slave, but you have to sign a contract with this individual so you can actually work for the individual for a season or two, perhaps a year, and you're going to get paid, in other words. Like, it's a wage labor, in other words, okay? But you have to stay under contract. You have to stay in the plantation, okay? So it's almost like the labor is being secured now under a contractual obligation. Okay? It's not that they're treated as property like in the past, but there's a contractual bond there, in other words. Okay, so the aim is that Southern planters and ex-Confederates, through the vagrancy laws, those black codes, they were attempting to preserve their pre-war labor system now in a new, more, I will say, capitalist fashion, if you will. And in capitalism, there's contracts, there's wage labor, and so on. Okay, so radical Republicans or Republicans, you don't need to be a radical actually to be totally against what Johnson was doing, but Republicans were totally against it. They're looking at the South, how the South is unfolding. They're saying, well, there's no change, and it's almost like the South is going back. They're going backwards, in other words, really going back to this old way. So this is going to create a rift between the Republicans and Johnson, in which there will be a struggle, between Johnson and the Republican Party, leading up to the impeachment crisis, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The Republican Party tried to impeach him and remove him from office because he was blocking congressional reconstruction. He was blocking all of the legislation, all of the bills emanating from Congress, in which the Republicans were trying to bring about change in the South, but Johnson was simply just blocking it. There were no reasons why he was doing it. There were no logical arguments other than he was just vetoing, again, that legislation. Okay, for example, he vetoed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson was no supporter of the Bureau, that's for sure. But when the Bureau was trying to renew its lifespan for another year, Congress actually provided the extension. They extended the lifetime of the Bureau for another year, but Johnson vetoed, the extension, saying, well, just taking too much resources. This institution is not really doing its job, etc. He just went ahead and vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, there's no logical argument. It was needed. The Bureau was actually needed in the South, to protect the freed population. Second, in 1866, in the same year, he vetoed an act of Congress that was intended to provide citizenship and civil rights to the freed population. It's called the Civil Rights Act. In other words, for the freed population to enjoy the same rights, like the Bill of Rights, for example, life, liberty, and property, etc. Okay, and so when Johnson was now asked to sign the Civil Rights Act, he vetoed it. There's no argument, a logical argument that he was providing other than he was just against it. He's just, again, blocking Reconstruction. So at that point, Congress, which is dominated by Republicans, understand what the game is. In other words, he's just going to veto everything we do. So what we need to do is override his veto. Okay, so the presidential vetoes can be overridden, by the way, with a two-thirds majorities in both the House and the Senate. So whenever there's a two-thirds majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, they can actually override the veto of the president, by the way. And that's exactly what they're now doing. Congress is now going to initiate new bills, knowing very well that Johnson is going to veto them, and they're going to simply override Johnson's veto. For example, the 14th Amendment. They said, well, we're going to actually amend the Constitution. We already abolished slavery in the 13th Amendment, but in the 14th Amendment, we're going to actually grant citizenship to all the freedmen. In other words, this is, again, an amendment that said that all persons born in the United States or in any of the territories of the United States, regardless of race and color, are citizens of the nation. Okay, and that they enjoy the same liberties and rights and immunities that the Constitution provides to all citizens. In other words, they are all treated equally before the law. Equal treatment, equal status before the law, because everybody is citizen. In other words, so he reads the 14th Amendment and he vetoes the 14th Amendment only for Congress to override the presidential veto, and it passed. But now, of course, there's going to be now a very, very clear struggle between the executive and the legislative branches. They're now in a struggle. There's a tension, there's a struggle, and this continues in 1866 when Congress passed another Freedmen's Bureau. It created a new one that will last for a series of years. Okay, instead of being renewed every year, they said, well, we need to create another Freedmen's Bureau that will last, a good time to be in the South. And the same thing happens. Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau. Congress overrode the veto, but now Johnson understand what Congress is doing. So to get back at Congress, as a form of retribution, Johnson is beginning to now remove all the appointments that Congress made to the Bureau, and he's replacing all of the personnel, again, of the Freedmen's Bureau with military generals and officers that are from the ex-Confederacy. In other words, so the Freedmen's Bureau is not going to be led by Northerners. There is going to be Southerners that are going to be in charge of the Bureau. So once you do that, the Bureau will be totally useless because it's going to be governed by the same people that are blocking Reconstruction, of course. So this was, the last straw that broke the camel's back, in other words. So that led to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Congress implemented a series of charges against Johnson. Particularly, it's just blocking Reconstruction. He's obstructing Reconstruction, and he was impeached in the House, and he underwent a trial in the Senate, and he was saved by one vote in the Senate that fell short from actually removing Johnson from office. So he remained in office, but he was totally impeached by the House. He just was not removed from the post by the Senate, but that was a warning. In other words, what Congress actually said here is that, look, either you step aside or we're just going to remove you, the next time, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so at any rate, So because the Johnson is losing popularity, he's losing support from the public, particularly from the North. He's falling out of favor. Now Congress is stepping in to lead the way, in Reconstruction. So Congress is in charge now. Okay, Congress is not the president; it's congressional Reconstruction. But this time, Congress is implementing policies that are the most radical, again, policies of Reconstruction. That's why this is called radical Reconstruction, congressional radical Reconstruction, a 10-year period between 1867 and 1877. Congress was actually passing laws to revamp the entire South, because by now the minority group of radical Republicans have become the majority. Most Republicans by now, because of Johnson, they're convinced that what the South needed was deep radical change. Here we are, they said, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, was actually leading the way. He was the president of the United States, and look what he was actually doing in the South. Look what Southerners were doing. So they said, no, the South needs change. Now we're convinced that more than ever, okay, it's not enough to free the slaves. We have to make sure that the freed population are citizens, and they're going to be enjoying all of the civil, rights, voting rights, not only the right to vote, but even holding office, etc. We want deep change, in other words, okay? So the radical Republicans are now in charge, and their aim is that they want Reconstruction to be like a laboratory, like an experiment, to bring about, a new society that is interracial, multiracial democracy, they said. Okay, now they said this is the time to test out again what we can actually do. Let's bring a new United States. Let's bring a new South altogether, a multiracial democracy. So to accomplish that, in 1867, they passed what is called the First Reconstruction Act. The First Reconstruction Act of 1867, in which they said to really reform the South, we need to rebuild every southern state from scratch. So let's remove the status of statehood. They're going to start as far back as territories. Now they're territories. They're not states. And they have to gain the status of statehood by writing new constitutions altogether. Okay? And from there, we start building up, again, all changes. It's called the First Reconstruction Act. Territory status to all the ex-Confederate states, dividing them into 5 military districts. So the entire southern, the ex-Confederacy was broken up into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general. Okay, each general governed each one of those districts. You can see here. Again, Texas, Louisiana form one, Arkansas and Mississippi another, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida another one, North and South Carolina another one, and Virginia another one. Those are 5 districts. And from there, we start building up again. They have to write new constitutions that are Republican. What is a Republican Constitution? A Republican Constitution is one in which there's no slavery, first and foremost. There's no monarchy, okay? And there's no nobility. Nobody can be called a prince or a duke, an archduke, a baron, etc. Nobody. Okay? No aristocracy, in other words. Everybody's a citizen, in other words. Of course, that really, what it did is that it disfranchised the ex-Confederates. All ex-Confederates were disfranchised at that point. That is to say, all the ex-Confederate officials, politicians, soldiers, could not participate, again, in voting as well. In Texas, for example, there were anywhere between 7,000 to 10,000 ex-Confederates that lost their right to vote because they were part of the Confederacy. So they could not participate in voting or holding office. They were driven out of power altogether, altogether. Not just as an example, that happened to every state, by the way. All the ex-Confederates, there were tens of thousands of them that were ousted from power. They couldn't even vote, in other words. Also, that those southern states in their constitution needed to ratify the 14th Amendment. In other words, that there will be no slavery, but also that it will grant citizenship to all people born in the state, regardless of race and color. It will ratify this 14th Amendment that is part of the U.S. Constitution now, in which in your Constitution you have to acknowledge that you have to grant citizenship to all the people of your state because they were born there. In other words, just by virtue that they were born in your state, then they're citizens of the United States. In other words, regardless of race and color. That was the first Reconstruction Act. Then the second Reconstruction Act, passed in the same year, brought about what is called now the voting process. Okay, the right to vote, military enforcement of all black voting. Again, the black population, that they're going to have to now participate in the political process, the right to vote, that the Union Army is going to be educating them, teaching them where to go and register to vote, and they're going to try to protect as well, that population in terms of, where they needed to go and vote, etc., protect them in the process of voting and the like. And also, at this point, during the second Reconstruction process, Congressional Reconstruction, Congress passed the 15th Amendment just to make sure that in the U.S. Constitution, there's going to be a universal male suffrage, that there will be voting rights to all males regardless of race and color. So they even amended, again, in this process during Reconstruction, the U.S. Constitution to make sure that all males, regardless of race and color, will be, of course, enjoying the right to vote. Okay, so that's extremely important. Okay, so now moving quickly here, we're going to see now the rise of the Republican Party in the South. Okay, because we got now the Union Army in charge of the South. The ex-Confederates are ousted from power. They don't participate in politics because they were associated with the Confederacy. So this opened the doors. It opened the gate, I should say, for the rise of the Republican Party now in the South. There will be now a new wave, a new party on the rise in the South, is the Republican Party. It was a northern party, but now it's coming to the South. And it's coming to the South through an alliance, if you will. Okay, an alliance of two groups of people. Okay, what's called a biracial coalition. Okay, two groups of people that are going to come together in order to bring about this interracial democracy that will extend civil rights to all of the now African American population. Because now we can talk about African American, because once you grant citizenship to the freed population, they're now citizens, in other words, of the United States. So therefore, they're now going to be called from this point African American population. And so it is precisely this coalition, this alliance between, first and foremost, the Unionists in the South. There were Unionists, Unionist Democrats, for example, and the radical Republicans coming from the North. Okay, so they're Northern radical Republicans coming to the South, coming together with Unionist Democrats, and they're going to constitute one bloc that is going to be essential for the rise of the Republican Party. They're going to become Republicans, in other words, and they're going to build a bridge and bring another block of people in the South. Of course, the black abolitionists, the voters, in other words, the African American population, the voters, as well as those African Americans elected to political office. Again, during this time, African Americans are going to be elected in office, during Congressional Reconstruction. Okay, and so at this point, we're just gonna skip here, so we can actually our time is at this point constricted, so we have to be moving forward now. to look at what the reaction is going to be to the rise of the Republican Party, which, by the way, is allowing now the right to vote to African Americans. They're now voting. Some of them are actually elected in office, by the way. And the Republican Party is going to be in the South helping the process of Reconstruction. There's going to be a lot of companies that are coming to the South from the North for construction work. They're being given contracts to build roads and bridges, schools, hospitals, for example, public buildings. Again, so there's a lot of construction work, by the way, but that construction work is done by Northerners, by the way. So Northerners come to the South, and they're going to be given contracts, once again, to rebuild the South, to rebuild it. And the Republican Party in the South is the one that is actually in charge of those contracts and is giving those companies, again, entitlements, if you will, concessions or land grants, etc., in order to engage in all this massive construction work, by the way. There's going to be also black schools as well, schools built to raise the literacy level of the African American population, educate African American children, and so on. So, of course, there's an intense effort to rebuild the South in a physical way, but also in a social and political way as well, in which the African American population is now participating in the political process. So this is going to be, something that the most conservative sectors of Southern society are going to react to in ways that this is going to lead to waves and waves of violence. In other words, there will be a Southern reaction to this radical change taking place in their society. Because what they see is that things are moving in such a fast speed, fast rate, in that they just don't recognize their own society anymore. Okay? Consider, for example, still 1857, 1860. You look at the South, and the South is pretty much, the way people have lived, for centuries. Okay, society is very structured. We got a planter class on the top, and they dominate all the land, all the economy and politics of the state. And you have, of course, a slave population that is also substantial, 4.5 million slaves that don't vote, don't read, don't write, again, for the most part. And don't have any rights as well. They're not even citizens as well. They're treated as property, for example. And you got, of course, some small farmers as well, in the South. And it's almost like everybody just knew their place, if you will, where people needed to be. And just in very short period of time, when you look at 1867, 1868. Southerners look around and they don't recognize anything. The slave population has been set free. Millions, again, of slaves are now free. They're citizens of the United States. They enjoy all of the civil rights of the Constitution. And they're now, voting. And some of them are being elected into office as well. Okay? So what a change, so they don't really recognize what is going on around them. The South has been defeated in the effort to preserve the way of life, the society of the South, and the South has been defeated. And again, the most conservative elements, the most conservative individuals or groups in the South are reacting to this. They're very much afraid that what's going on is the disintegration, in other words, of their culture and their society. So when people have anxieties because they're threatened by the changes taking place around them and so on, they often react again they're influenced by fear. They're very fearful, and when people are afraid, they react violently, in other words. Okay, so that's exactly what happened again, because people are afraid of the changes and they're happening very rapidly. They're going to react violently by creating, for example, certain organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, the KKK. That the main aim of the Ku Klux Klan was to restore the Democratic Party in power. In other words, what we need to do is save in the South, and the way to save it is to make sure that the Democrats come back. Because once you have the Democratic Party back in power, then then nothing will change. Democratic Party is going to save the old South, in ways that many of the structures, the way people live, and so on, are going to be preserved. Okay, they use intimidation, violence against black voters, driving them from the voting places in many cases, or just harassing them in many cases, attacking black communities, gatherings. It was very common for any gathering to be subject for violence as well, or black communities as well. And they were also enforcing what is called the black codes. The KKK was also enforcing the vagrancy laws, making sure that there were no people without employment roaming around and trying to get them into an agricultural company to go back to a plantation and so on, or to teach them a trade. There were apprentice laws as well. It's another black code. The apprentice laws was a method by which people that have no skills, no trade of their own, could be taught one. They could become an apprentice of a master artisan to gain skills, so that person can be useful in the economy as well. Again, so this is what the KKK is doing. During this time, it's a reaction. It's a violent reaction, against Reconstruction. All right, so let's look at the end of Reconstruction. What is the end of Reconstruction? Reconstruction will come to an end by 1877. This process was totally completed. Well, not really completed, but it came to a close again. Whether the policies or the objectives were fulfilled or not, by 1877, it was a closed case. So I will outline several factors that led to the end of Reconstruction. Factors that by 1873 are now pushing the country closer and closer to the end of Reconstruction. So number one, the country was going through, by 1873, an economic depression. An economic depression hit the United States. It was not as profound or severe as the Great Depression of the 1930s. There's no comparison, but there was growing unemployment. 12% unemployment was considered massive during that time. Falling prices. There was an agricultural depression as well, in prices of crops, etc. So what that did is that many Americans, millions of Americans, began to worry more about the economy than worry about Reconstruction. In other words, what we need to do is solve the crises. What can we do about unemployment? How can we recover, agriculture? What kind of policies, etc. The conversation is changing. Reconstruction is still important. Yeah, Americans care about that, but now the economy is taking center stage. So this is, changing the national conversation. The values, the attention, the priorities are changing. Number two is that because the Republicans have been in office ever since 1860, they were blamed for the economic depression. So because the Republicans were blamed, then the issue of Reconstruction, which was the main issue of the Republican Party, is going to also be discredited. In other words, maybe this economic depression happened because Republicans have been so worried about Reconstruction, they forgot about the economy. Now, people are blaming the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is losing a lot of appeal, its popularity, support, is losing support. Again, so the issue of Reconstruction is coming along with it as well, because that's a Republican issue. In other words, it's a Republican goal, Reconstruction. So people don't want to listen to Republicans anymore when they coming out to talk about Reconstruction. They just don't want to listen to either a Republican or they don't want to talk about Reconstruction. Number three is that in the elections, the South is going through massive elections, okay, starting in 1875, 76. In the South, people had to elect their governors, for example. Okay, they have to choose their new governors. And in the South, there's going to be a massive mobilization of people to try to prevent the Republicans from winning the elections. And they want to bring back the Democratic Party back in office. And it's called the redemption of the South. To redeem the South is to free the South of this Republican leadership, in other words. So they want the restoration of the Democratic Party. And the way they did it is by implementing a strategy that was first implemented in Mississippi. Okay, in the state of Mississippi, the strategy was rather simple. Again, when people went to vote, they sent thousands of people to the voting places, to the voting booths, to prevent Republicans from actually casting a vote. That was so simple. And people knew who the Republican voters were. Okay, many of them were Northerners, for example. Many of them were African Americans and so on. So they were just driving away people, physically preventing them from casting a vote. And so because they were not allowed to vote, then the elections at the end, gave the Democratic Party the victory. So this was known as the Mississippi Plan. It worked so well that after Mississippi, this plan was implemented all over the South. State after state after state started going back Democrat, Democrat. So by 1876, the entire South had been redeemed, so to speak. Redeeming is like had been totally now being purified from Republican leadership, they said. Okay, so now the Democratic Party is back. By 1876, it's back in office. Again, this is very crushing from the standpoint of the goals of Reconstruction. And the final factor that brought the end of Reconstruction is the presidential election of 1877. In this presidential election of 1877, it was now clear that the Republican Party was going to have very tough time actually winning the election because of the economic depression. Because of the economic depression and because this growing discontent in the country about the Republican Party, people are not really, thinking about voting Republican, even in the North, by the way. But now the entire South, has gone Democrat. So the possibility for a Democratic president was very real. And this presidential election, in which the Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden, a Southerner, and the Republicans nominated Rutherford Hayes, a Northerner, came very close, so close that this was a contested election because it was such a close match. In other words, people needed to run recounts in several states, particularly in the southern states, just to verify who had, for a few hundred votes, who's going to have the majority. Okay, so both sides claimed victory. They both said they won the election, and it seemed that the country was going to go to another crisis once again, another crisis. So to save the Union, to save the United States, another split, because the South could be just leaving the Union once again, it was possible. There was a compromise called the Great Compromise of 1877, in which the two sides approached, Democrats and Republicans, and they said, look, let's end, this crisis with a compromise. So Southerners came forth and said, look, we're willing to concede. We're willing to tell you, to tell the country that we lost and you won. You, the Republicans, will win again, with only a few conditions. Okay, and the conditions are, okay, that you will have to withdraw, okay, the Union Army, okay, from the South, the U.S. federal troops. You have to withdraw them, okay, remove them from the South, and you have to end Reconstruction. In other words, from this point on, we're not going to reform the South any longer. There will be no further change whatsoever. We already changed, in certain things. We freed the slaves and so on, but that's about it. Accept us back into the Union, and that's it. That's the end of Reconstruction. Oh, and by the way, build us a new railroad. Okay, build us a new railroad. You kind of destroy the one we got. So with that, you get a deal. It's a compromise, in other words. So in order to save the country from another crisis, the North, in this case, had to, pretty much accept the compromise. Look, we're not going to push for Reconstruction anymore. We already changed the South somewhat. So let's leave it like that. In other words, whatever change happened already happened, but we're not going to force those southern states to continue providing, for example, enforcing, for example, civil rights and voting rights and all that. Like, look, it's a closed deal. In other words, look, it's that's the end of it. In other words, okay. So the end results of Reconstruction is by 1877, the ex-Confederate states were readmitted back into the Union. Okay, so we got the reunification of the country. The southern states came back into the Union with significant change. They came back with Republican constitutions, Republican charters, abolishing titles of nobility, and ratifying the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States, regardless of race and color. And the 15th Amendment, the right to vote as well. And slavery came to an end and was replaced by a more capitalist system of labor. It was labor contracts and sharecropping, in other words. And sharecropping is when people grow products or crops on the land of somebody else and pay rents in terms of a portion of the harvest, a share of the crop, in other words. So those were arrangements that, of course, are going to really replace the system of slavery, in the South. This is the end of this topic, and this is the end of this class. This is the last topic of the semester. With this, we conclude, U.S. History 1301. We arrived to 1877. We have already seen, of course, the process of the Civil War and Reconstruction. This is the end of the course, and thank you for staying, and watching all of the videos, of this class. That's all I have for you. And if you ever take History 1302, then I'll see you then in the next episode of U.S. History 1302, with moving now further again in the timeline with the rise of building modern America. That's if you take 1302. Thank you.